Until now, this was the only way to get juice from an orange.
Rob, I'll say it then and I'll say it again. I never stabbed Mass Transit. Mass Transit told me to cut him.
It's a 7 News exclusive, and we want to point out before we show the pictures, some of the video is violent and graphic.
On this episode of Juice, we'll be discussing the time New Jack stabbed someone. Well, one of the times he stabbed someone. Better known as the Mass Transit Incident. Fans of professional wrestling may be familiar with the Monday Night Wars, a period of immense popularity and attention for the professional wrestling industry, lasting from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, spurred on by direct competition between the then World Wrestling Federation, now WWE, and World Championship Wrestling. But there was a third promotion scratching and clawing for a place among the wrestling giants. Paul Heyman had watched from the spectator stands as the two corporate giants battled for wrestling supremacy. In 1993, he took over booking duties in Eastern Championship Wrestling, later renaming the company Extreme Championship Wrestling. Heyman's vision for ECW was to counter-program the more sanitized WWF and WCW products with increased violence, coarse language, sexual references, and a much more gritty, urban feel. On November 23, 1996, things became a little too urban in ECW, when a plucky young backyard wrestler named Eric Koulas etched an infamous place for himself in professional wrestling lore. Unfortunately for him, his moment of glory would wind up becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of failing to take this unique performance art seriously. As a lifelong wrestling fanatic, I'll be the first to admit that at its core, pro wrestling boils down to little more than grown men dressed as figure skaters, LARPing as MMA fighters. But as much as this may ring true in a lot of ways, especially to the uninitiated, wrestling is also a highly intricate performance art which, much like contemporary dance or classical acting, takes years to learn and even longer to master. New Jack, real name Jerome Young, had first come to national prominence as part of Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling, where his militant black gangster persona drew him nuclear heat with the mainly white Southern audience. He was able to leverage the high racial tensions in the United States at the time in the wake of the Rodney King and O.J. Simpson cases. New Jack would become known for the kind of extreme violence and unprofessionalism in the ring that marks this very topic, but personally, I was always a fan of his charisma. Just look at his command of the audience in this promo he and tag team partner Mustafa Saeed cut for SMW in 1994. While New Jack would never be known as a mat technician, there's an undeniable X factor to him that explains why he was able to maintain a spot on ECW cards for so many years. Whether you love him or hate him, the motherfucker was over. Many people also cite New Jack's unpredictability and controversial act as a reason WWF or WCW never took a serious look at him. However, it was these very qualities that made him a perfect fit in the unhinged ECW environment. Paul Heyman was also extremely good at accentuating the strengths and hiding the weaknesses of his talent, and he protected the character by never putting Jack in a situation he'd flounder in. That is to say, a standard wrestling match. Jack would come to be known for his highly dangerous dives, as well as leaving his theme song playing throughout the duration of his entire match. Something which bugged the shit out of me, but which the ECW faithful seemed to lap up. While they didn't pay the kind of guaranteed money that their evil stepbrothers WWF and WCW did, Heyman allowed for a much higher degree of creative freedom for the talent. And some of the biggest names in the history of the business went to finishing school in ECW, leaving the organization as much stronger performers than they were when they came in. Even though many of these names, such as Steve Austin and Mick Foley, had left for bigger and better things by 1996, their presence, along with the talent brought over from Japan and Mexico during 1994 and 1995, had allowed ECW to grow from a regional independent promotion into a brand on the cusp of national prominence. The mass transit incident threatened to derail everything ECW had built up to that point. New Jack's unchecked bloodlust and aggressive disposition had nearly resulted in the death of a rookie performer who wrestling tradition dictates he should have been looking out for in the ring. The media coverage portrayed Coolus as a victim of a murderous bully who took sadistic pleasure in hurting him beyond what was called for in a scripted performance.
When you went there that night, you knew it wasn't going to be choir practice.
Right.
That's fair to say.
Yes.
But did you think it would be this bad?
No, I didn't. Not in my wildest dreams. I don't think in anybody else's wildest dreams. They savagely attacked me. They crucified me in front of 1,000 people.
Eric's dad says he was in the audience screaming, telling anyone who would listen to stop the fight. That just must have been painful to sit and watch. This is your own kid here.
Is, like I said, it's the worst night of my life.
Do you wish you just never went there that night?
Of course. You know, I wish I could take back the night.
You still have the scar on your forehead? Show me the scar there.
Right here. I have no feeling from here to here. I have like an indentation in my head from where all the nerves died.
We tried to get Young's side of the story. Did you do any of this? You don't want to give your side?
I'm not going to court.
This could have resulted in huge problems not only for ECW, but also for WWF and WCW, who at the time were beginning to follow Heyman's lead and were slowly revitalizing their television products by increasing the adult content and level of violence in their own program. It would have created huge problems, that is, if this version of events hadn't have been a huge steaming pile of pig shit. Now, I'm not going to try and defend New Jack's history of bad behavior, nor will I deny the culpability of ECW in all of this, since after all, they did approve of Coolus and they did put him in the ring. What I will defend, however, is this idea propagated in the media that somehow ECW went out of its way to victimize an inexperienced wrestler. After all, ECW was only 6 months out from its first ever pay-per-view event, Barely Legal. Why No Minors, No Exceptions tagline on the Barely Legal poster was a reference to mass transit. Coolus was a substitution for a wrestler who was unable to attend the house show that night. The pudgy pugilist allegedly showed up at the building late after all the other talents had already arrived, and notably did not go around and introduce himself to everyone and shake their hand. Now, a young guy like Coolus might be understandably nervous meeting a bunch of people he presumably idolized and looked up to. It's an old-timey tradition in wrestling, though, to introduce yourself and shake everyone's hand in the building, especially if you're a first-timer in the locker room, and an experienced wrestler, even one with minor experience, would know this, as it's usually one of, if not the very first thing, a trainee wrestler gets taught before they ever step in the ring. I also believe the late arrival to the building and keeping himself to himself was a tactic devised by Coolus to avoid any attention in the locker room, possibly inviting unwanted questions about his experience and background in the wrestling business. The following few minutes is taken from the mass transit segment on the unauthorized ECW documentary, Forever Hardcore.
Axel Rotten didn't show up. Something happened with his grandmother. So Devon didn't have a partner. Devon Dudley didn't have a partner. And this kid comes up with a tape saying that he's worked before, yada, yada, yada.
This kid had said he was trained by Killer Kowalski, and he said he was, older than what he was. I forget what he said, but at the time he was 16, 17. I believe he said he was 19.
Mass Transit was a young guy. I think he was just excited. He had his family there, and he wanted to get some spots in.
So the kid lies about his age, lies about his experience, and walks around the locker room, and he has completely no etiquette whatsoever.
Then he said he wanted to get color, but he didn't know how to do it. He asked me would I do it. And I said, yeah, I'll do it, gladly.
And he's sitting there next to Taz, lighting up his cigarette, telling Paulie who he's going to be in the ring. And he's telling the gangsters and Devon Dudley what they're going to do in their match. No, you sit there, you shut up, you listen, and, hopefully, you get invited back.
So when it came when the time came for him to get color, I cut the shit out of him. Now he didn't say this long or this long. He just said he wanted to bleed, so I cut him.
And the first thing he does is he looks down and then he grabs his head and then he does this a couple of times. And it wasn't funny, but it just kind of struck us as funny because when he looks down and he sees the blood and realizes how bad he's cut, he screamed like a little girl. It looked like somebody kicked him in the balls real hard. You know, he had nothing but that high falsetto going on.
You can see his skull. You know how your skulls are like mended together? You can see it. I cut that boy deep. I cut the shit out of him. I had like a surgical scaffold. Everybody said it was like an X-Acto knife, whatever the hell it is. I had a surgical scalpel and I had on a piece of wood and I just cut him real hard, like, and he bled a lot.
It was odd because whenever they got back to the dressing room, New Jack had to scram. The cops were pissed, and they were the ones that were actually pressing charges.
Now, as you can see from this footage, first of all, New Jack comes across like a fucking asshole here. Whether he's exaggerating and being a character for the camera, or whether he's just a plain cunt, I'll let you decide. Although I will point out that New Jack at the time of this interview had been sued, vilified, and demonized by media coverage of what happened here despite New Jack's inflammatory attitude was an accident. An accident which was caused by a combination of poor planning on the part of ECW and a fan who wanted to be a wrestler without putting in the work. The fact remains, however, that if we took the exact same set of circumstances and duplicated them with, say, Coolis's tag team partner Devon Dudley in his place, we wouldn't be talking about this today. It all comes back to the fact that this kid was untrained and therefore unprepared for the real dangers of wrestling. The police decide to press charges, Coolis and his father jump at the chance for some money and attention, and we're off to the races. The only problem with this game plan, unfortunately for Pop and Cub, is that you can't be stabbed, I made quotation marks as I read that, if you're sitting in a ring offering up your forehead to be cut. The criminal court found that this was an accident and that New Jack was not liable for Coolis's injuries. The civil case that followed ended in an identical result. As stupid and violent as these court officials probably thought ECW was, the sub-story tactics of the Coolis clan failed to move them the way that it moved the news media. Any racket as Jack had been there. Request TV, one of the pay-per-view distributors carrying Barely Legal, pulled their support after Wade Keller went out of his way to alert them about the incident, just in case you thought dirt sheet writers were objective journalists. It was only after a Herculean email campaign from the ECW fanbase that Barely Legal got put back on the schedule, although several distributors such as Cablevision still refused to show it. Rumors have persisted over the years that Coolis himself had no intention of suing ECW and in fact wanted to use the incident as a way to sort of pay his dues in the locker room. The degree to which Coolis was actually involved in the media smear tactics remain unclear, as after all, he was just a teenager when all of this happened. While I can't agree with the way he went about it, I do admire Coolis's passion for the business. I think that with some proper training, a person of his size could have been a decent talent. Sadly, we will never know, as Eric passed away at only 22 years of age following complications from gastric bypass surgery. You might be sitting at home, if you made it this far, thinking that there's been several contradictory statements throughout the video. And you'd be right. The mass transit incident is a story of contradictions. While the conduct of New Jack is definitely questionable here, the wrestling business is full of half-truths. And in this case, we seem to be getting half-truths from all parties involved here, and it's up to us as fans to fill in the blanks. If you enjoyed the episode, consider becoming a juice loosener on Patreon for exclusive extra content and plenty of other crunchy bits of goodness. Until next time, take care.
Any regrets about that whole incident?
I don't regret it. He hadn't been in the ring. I mean, fuck. I mean, they told me he was 20 and I found he was 17. That was not my fault. Do I regret it? No, I don't regret it. Welcome to the business.